Silverchair. Most people remember them as an Australian Nirvana knockoff from the 90s. They released one good album and then disappeared off the face of the earth. But that's not actually what happened. Part 1. The myth. Newcastle, New South Wales. A little town in regional Australia that is, with all due respect, not exactly the cultural capital of the universe. It's the kind of place where if you told someone you were going to be in an internationally famous rock band, they'd laugh the way you laugh at a kid saying they want to be an astronaut. Sure mate, good luck with that. This matters because when people talk about Silverchair, they tend to flatten them into a music industry story. 3 kids in the right place at the right time. But these weren't kids who grew up in LA with industry connections and famous parents. They were literally just 3 14-year-olds who were bored and started a band in someone's garage because what the fuck else is there to do in Newcastle? The band was called Innocent Criminals. Daniel Johns on guitar and vocals, Ben Gillies on drums, and Christian Au on bass. They enter a national band competition. They somehow win against the thousands of entries. They record a demo. The song, Tomorrow, ends up on the radio, and it absolutely blows up. Number 1 in Australia, then famous in America. Sony signs them. It's every garage band's dream. They changed their name to Silverchair. Cold as hell if you ask me, and at just 15 years old, they decide to get into a real studio and record their debut album, Frog Stomp. It goes double platinum. They're on the cover of Rolling Stone, they're touring the world, they're doing interviews, and these 3 kids are all, to be very clear about this, still in high school. Insanity. And the press, who are never ones to resist a lazy comparison, take one look at the guitar tones and flannel and dub them the Australian Nirvana.
We're getting really pissed off with comparisons.
And I'll be fair, and I say this through gritted teeth, you can see why. Frog Stomp was loud and heavy and raw. Daniel Johns has long blonde hair, Kurt Cobain had literally just died. The world was looking for something, or someone, to pour all that grief and energy into. And here were 3 teenagers from regional Australia who sounded, on the surface, like they fit the bill. But this comparison set expectations that Silverchair spent the next decade failing to meet. Because every time the press and label and the audience went, that album was brilliant, give us more of that, they said absolutely not, and went in the complete opposite direction. And this is where the story gets interesting. Act 2. The Pivot. Freak Show. A title that, in retrospect, was probably the most accurate album ever named. Before we even get into the music, I need to tell you about the album cover because it is nuts and nobody talks about it enough. The cover is an illustration of a man named Grady Stiles Jr. Grady was a real person. He was a sideshow performer from the 1940s through to the 60s, known professionally as the Lobster Boy because he had a condition called electrodactyly that fused his fingers into claws. And if you're thinking, okay, that's a tad tasteless, but whatever, edgy album art, very 1997, I haven't finished. Grady Stiles Jr. was also, separately, a convicted murderer. He shot his daughter's fiancé the night before their wedding. He got away with it because the prosecution argued he'd die in prison due to his condition. He then got killed himself years later by a hitman his second wife hired because she was afraid of him. And that's the image on the cover of Silverchair's second album. Sony had to issue a disclaimer. So why did they choose it? Johns described the whole experience of being in Silverchair, the touring, the interviews, being stared at, as being exactly like a traveling freak show. You're the exhibit. People pay to look at you. And you can see how he got to that point.
Hello here, Bill. Actually, yes, here we are with some many wet Silverchair fans, but they're having a good time nonetheless.
John said he had a military security guard whose job was to follow him everywhere, and I mean everywhere, including the bathroom. He was 17 and he couldn't go to the bathroom without an armed escort because the fan obsession had gotten that extreme. His manager was fielding calls from fans threatening to hurt themselves if they couldn't talk to him. There were women, grown-ass women by the way, his mother's age, who had become convinced that Daniel Johns was the reincarnation of the children they'd lost or never had, and they kept finding ways to get backstage. He went back home to Newcastle between legs of the tour and he didn't want to leave the house. And all of that is in the music if you listen for it. Freak Show wasn't a better Frog Stomp like many people think it was. It was an album about what Frog Stomp did to them. It's the sound of 3 kids who accidentally became the biggest band in Australia trying to figure out what the hell just happened to their lives. And one more thing because it matters for what comes next. Buried near the end of Freak Show is a song called Cemetery. It's very slow, especially compared to earlier songs. Actual string arrangements, violins, cellos. Johns had written it years earlier and almost didn't want to put it on the album, but his band members and publishers convinced him otherwise. It sounds nothing like the rest of Freak Show. It sounds actually like the beginning of Neon Ballroom, which is exactly what it was. Because here's what nobody around Daniel Johns seemed to understand. Or maybe they did but just didn't care. The worse things got for him personally, the better the music got. And things are about to get a lot worse. Act 3. Neon Ballroom. So after the Freak Show tour ends, the plan was to take a year off. Johns goes home to Newcastle. Gillies and Janelle, by all counts, get straight back into normal life. They hang out, watch TV, whatever. Johns goes home and completely falls apart. He stops leaving the house, not in a I need some time to decompress way, in a genuine clinical agoraphobia way. He writes hundreds of poems. He doesn't listen to any music except his own, and he later says that during this period of time he hated music, everything about it. But he felt like a slave to it, like he physically couldn't stop. He's only 19 years old. And then he comes up for an idea with an album. The album is called Neon Ballroom. Neon Ballroom was how Johns described a dissociative state, that feeling of being detached from your own life as if you're watching yourself from a distance. Everything is bright and loud and completely unreal. The record opens with a 6-minute song called Motion Sickness. It's about trying to escape mental illness without medication. And the very first sound you hear is a piano, played by David Helfgott. Now, if you don't know who David Helfgott is, he's an Australian concert pianist who has schizoaffective disorder and whose life story was turned into an Oscar-winning film called Shine. He is, to put it nicely, a chaotic presence in a recording studio. According to the band's biographer, before every single take, he would announce to no one in particular, "We're going to Music Land." There's a children's choir on Anthem for the year 2000, which is also somehow one of the most furious rock songs of the decade about youth rejecting authority, written because Johns had a dream about an overweight man in suits telling young people what to do, which, if you know anything about his relationship with the music industry at that point, it is not exactly subtle what he's trying to get across. And then there's Anna's song, which is about his struggles with anorexia. In 1999, way before anyone talked about this stuff, and before men in particular were allowed to talk about this stuff. When it came out, he started getting letters from people saying, "You helped me admit what was happening to me." They said that he saved their lives. It is a criminally underrated song, in my opinion. The music press in Australia called it the best record to date. In the US, it just barely cracked the top 50. It was made under conditions that should have produced nothing. Johns hated music when he wrote it. He could barely eat. He hadn't left his house in 6 months. Gillies and Janelle essentially had to coax him into the studio with the promise that this time it would be different, and it would actually be theirs. Silverchair went platinum again in Australia. Johns went back home to Newcastle. He started writing again almost immediately, and this time, for the first time in his entire career, he said it felt like joy, which is a remarkable thing to say from a man who was about to make the record that nearly killed him. Act 4. Diorama. Johns finishes Neon Ballroom, the tour wraps up, and he goes home and starts writing the next album. He described this period as the most enjoyment he's ever had writing music. He knew exactly what he wanted the album to be. He started shopping it to producers, and every single one of them either didn't understand it or wanted to change it. He eventually finds David Bottrell, who had worked with big names like Tool and Peter Gabriel and King Crimson. Johns co-produces the record himself for the first time, and then he called Van Dyke Parks. Now, Van Dyke Parks, if you know the name, and a lot of people don't, he's the guy who did the string arrangements on Brian Wilson's Smile, which is famous for being one of the most legendarily ambitious and troubled albums in rock history. Parks flies out. They spend weeks describing the music to each other in metaphors. Parks later described the whole experience as mind-blowing. The album that comes out of this is Diorama. It goes to #1 in Australia immediately again. The US label looks at it though and tells Johns it will be a difficult sell because it doesn't fit the American radio rock format of the time. Johns, in his own words, describes that format as something that, quite frankly, sucked. And he's not wrong. This is 2002. The American rock charts are, with no hate, I love them, but basically a Nickelback convention. And then just as the album comes out, as they're about to finally go and properly tour it internationally, properly make the case for it in America, Johns wakes up one morning and his knee is sore. He thinks he's sprained it in his sleep. 3 weeks later, he cannot walk. It spreads to both knees, his ankles, his back, his neck. He's diagnosed with reactive arthritis, a rare autoimmune condition probably triggered, his doctor suggests, by the toll the anorexia had already taken on his immune system, combined with the stress of the album. He said a specialist advised him to say goodbye to his family every night before bed because the doctor thought he might die. He's only 22. The entire international tour is cancelled, and while Johns is lying at home paralyzed, someone in the Silverchair team, and this is also documented, Johns named it, questioned out loud whether he was actually sick at all. He suggested that maybe he just didn't want to promote the new album and should be forced to tour instead of being mollycoddled. Johns wrote about this later, like, who the fuck wanted Diorama to be more successful than I did? He recovered eventually. The album won 5 ARIA awards, including Best Rock Album. It went triple platinum in Australia and it peaked at number 91 in America. And John said from that moment, lying at home paralyzed, being asked by colleagues if he was faking it, he knew Silverchair wouldn't last. In 2011, he gives an interview where he's asked about the future of Silverchair. He says Silverchair is no more. No press release, no official announcement, just that sentence in an interview. He'd already made the phone call. Act 5, the finale. Silverchair spent 12 years being told in various ways that what they were doing was wrong. Wrong sound, wrong direction, wrong ambition, wrong era. Every pivot they made lost them part of the audience they'd accidentally acquired. Every time they got more interesting, happening, fewer people outside of Australia were paying attention, but they did it anyways.
Our main goal is just people to hear this album and realise that we're not just a one-album band. Realise we're a band that's capable of producing more than one album and more than one song. We know that we don't expect this album to sell as many as the last one.
The music that came out of that stubbornness is some of the best Australian rock ever recorded, and most people outside Australia have never even heard it.